We head north once again as we go into Canada, Victoria, British Columbia to be exact, as we speak with an individual from Pacific Wild. We've been noticing a lot of posts and news and information really coming forth about the BC wolf call. And so we really want to get more information out to those of you that listen to Stephen and I on the regular about what's going on, the information, things that are happening inside of the government there. And really, who better to talk to at this moment than Mollie Cameron. She's the wolf campaigner for Pacific Wild. She's been with them since 2023, and she's an avid carnivore girl, as she's told us before we signed on. Mollie, great to speak to you, to meet with you. How you doing?
Yeah, great. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this has been something that it's been on my radar for a little bit. I know Stephen and I are going back and forth about stuff that we want to talk about, and this sort of hit a couple of the sections that we want to do, and you seem like you have the knowledge to dive deep into some of these topics. But give everybody just a little background on yourself. Native Canadian, where did you grow up? Where did your love for carnivores and all that stuff begin?
Yeah, I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, so very far from the West Coast. I was drawn out here by the whales. As a kid, I watched Free Willy so many times that I wore the VHS out twice. And so, yeah, I moved across the country in 2016. Became a whale watching captain. Predators were not my first love, but I had a lot of really strange experiences that kind of drew me to predators. Coming home one night from work, I was driving home and a dog ran out in front of my car, and I pulled over to put the dog in my car and find its owner. And the dog grabbed the tree and looked at me, and I said, "Oh, that's not a dog, that's a bear." Uh, so that was kind of my first experience with predators, but it kind of triggered this thing in me of growing up in Ontario. I didn't really have any experience with wildlife. And, you grow up thinking that predators are these evil, vicious creatures, and that's so far from the truth. They make such amazing efforts to avoid humans and conflict with humans. And, you know, um, from the bear experience, it kind of evolved from there. I was watching a friend's farm one evening, and there was a cougar about 10 feet from me in the dark making that like caterwauling noise. Um, before I finished saying, "What was that?" my ex-husband had pushed me out of the way and ran back to the vehicle by himself. Uh, it is, yeah. But again, one of those interesting experiences that, I just was so close to this mountain lion and it wanted nothing to do with me. And so, my interest and love for predators kind of grew from there.
Wow, those are some pretty awesome experience. I mean, the mountain lion one is insane. Just why whales? What was it about whales that brought you to the coast? And then we'll get into more of the predator aspect. What was it about whales that made you want to get to the coast and see them?
Oh, I mean, you watch Free Willy as a kid, right? And it's just magical. And I kind of never grew out of that interest for these incredible species. Um, as a kid, not knowing any better, I did visit marine land quite often in Ontario to try and have that experience with animals. And then, you grow up and you realize that those are not good things and not good environments for animals to be in. And then when I moved to the coast, one of the first experiences I had on the water was with J-Pod. And if you've ever watched Free Willy, the opening sequence of that movie is all the southern resident killer whales in the Juan de Fuca Strait. And so, coming full circle as a kid to watching that on film and then driving a boat and taking other people to see that as a career, um, was kind of all that I hoped for, as a child and growing up, and it's all I wanted. And so I was just really motivated to do it. But they're amazing animals and they're so intelligent. And I think all animals are really misunderstood in some ways, and admired in others, of course. But yeah, I just have always had this like intrinsic interest in wildlife. And as an adult, I obviously realized more that it was for predators, which a lot of people love animals, but it's like animals that kill. Yeah.
We've been getting a lot of movie talk lately.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
Free
Yeah, we've
Willy,
been
what was the
talking
other?
about
Fern Gully.
Fern Gully, Lord of the Rings. Yeah, we've been going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, with those. We're big fantasy fantasy movie guys. But describe this role at Pacific Wild, because what does a wolf campaigner mean, do, and what's the role inside of this larger organization? Because obviously Pacific Wild covers everything on the Pacific coast, with bears and whales and wolves and everything else. So what is your specific role and title, and how does that mesh inside this large organization?
Yeah, so Pacific Wild's a Canadian charity that works to protect wildlife and their habitats in British Columbia. As far as my role with Pacific Wild, I mean, I am the wolf campaigner, and so I'm advocating for the protection and understanding of wolves. We have had a provincial wolf call happening since 2015, and it's very much under the guise of protecting caribou. And so what happens is our government uses tax dollars to contract aerial marksmen to shoot wolves from helicopters. Um, they do a lot of, really disturbing practices to accomplish that. One of them being collaring wolves. They call Judas wolves. And essentially, when they put this radio collar on a wolf, they are unintentionally, you know, asking this animal to betray its family because they lead them back to entire packs and then they just shoot all of them. And so, my role here is trying to end that very inhumane and call that's happening in the province, because wolves are, ecosystem engineers. They're keystone species. We need them to promote biodiversity and ecosystems. And we've seen what happens in other parts of the world when wolves are eradicated, and we don't want to get to a point where we've had to reintroduce a species that we've seen be needed to be reintroduced into other areas of the world. It's proven the significance and the importance that they have on the landscape, and they deserve much better. And unfortunately, in British Columbia, they're very much treated as vermin. And so part of my role is trying to change that outlook and educate people on the importance of having wolves on the landscape.
So to that end, what's the history behind this predator prey relationship that you can get into? Because I've been reading a little bit about caribou and their significance to indigenous folks up in Canada, especially in these provinces, and how caribou is similar. I would say similar to elk, possibly moose somewhere in the West, possibly in the way people think of them or treat them as feeders of family and things like that. So where does this relationship start, if you can go back into the history, and why in 2015 does this cull begin?
Yeah, so it all goes back to habitat. I mean, as humans, we have had kind of devastating impacts on a lot of ecosystems, and a lot of it's driven by industrialization, economic greed, and growth. One of the biggest things that has impacted caribou is the destruction of old growth forests. And in the last 30 plus years, southern mountain caribou declined by 51%. And within this time frame, 37% of subpopulations were either fully or functionally extirpated from their range, and all that goes back to habitat loss. Caribou need old growth forests to support food and shelter. When we destroy these old growth forests, we're creating early cereal forests that support higher abundances of moose and deer, which is a wolf's primary prey. Wolves and other predators are opportunists, but in a fully intact landscape, they don't have those opportunities to go after caribou because they have the old growth to protect them. And when we're destroying forests, we're creating linear features for them to travel easier and predate on caribou as bycatch. And so, there's the potential for wolves to predate on caribou. The government believes that that's at an unsustainable rate for caribou recovery. That's a bit questionable. But if we have intact habitat, those bycatch predation incidents are less likely to occur.
Is logging the most impactful practice on I guess the reduction of old growth forests, or are there more?
Oh, there's more. Yeah. Logging, mining, even recreational activities like snowmobiling, oil and gas industries, all those things impact old growth.
So why the distinction between old growth and sort of, I guess, newer growth? How is it that caribou historically use old growth in a way that's advantageous?
Well, it supports higher abundances of food. When we destroy old growth habitat, we're reducing the food availability for these caribou, and we're also reducing shelter, right? Wolves are they can travel through forests, but they're not as likely to be in these old growth habitats that the caribou are relying on and seeking
Yeah,
shelter
I
in.
figure.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so when we destroy them, we're creating more opportunity for predators to get at them, and less food. I mean, no matter how many wolves we kill and we're destroying habitat, the caribou have nothing to eat.
Yeah, it's funny we talked about this in our last episode, just the how habitat loss is affecting ungulates in the US, and yet everyone turns towards predators as the culprits, as kind of this widespread messaging that it helps us avoid our own involvement, our own impact. Um, yeah, I mean, what would have to happen for the habitat to look or be more suitable for caribou? I guess second to restoring old growth, which is not possible.
I mean, protecting existing old growth for sure. We can't continue to destroy habitat and expect a different outcome. Um, and you're absolutely right. We are, as humans, like to distract from one problem so that we can continue with the agenda at play, which is obviously economic growth and creating jobs and things like that. But I mean, we live in such an incredible province, and we're such a destination for tourism, and that's largely because of our beautiful landscape and the wildlife that we have. And so if we continue to ruin those things, we're not going to have, destination British Columbia or any of the things that make people want to visit.
Yeah, no, you're totally accurate there. I mean, between so what with the old growth forest out of the way, what essentially is happening is you're losing protection, like literal physical protection for the caribou, and then because you're saying moose and deer sort of invade those newer growth or that lesser growth forest, are they pushing caribou out, and so the caribou just have lesser places to go? Is that accurate?
Uh, yes. I mean, when the caribou's habitat is destroyed, they're kind of wandering and trying to find, where to be. And so if all that exists is these secondary forests, they kind of had no choice but to be on that landscape. And, those other prey species already exist on that landscape because that's where their food and natural habitat is. And so it just kind of creates this opportunity for them to be predated on, while in conjunction, they're also trying to find food that's really not there for them.
Wow.
What are some of the other impacts of reducing old growth forests? I guess beyond the caribou story.
Well, I mean, straying away from caribou a little bit, I mean, we need old growth forests as a whole. I mean, they
Yeah.
support greater biodiversity and ecosystems. They're, a natural deterrent for wildfires. So, I mean, that is another way that it affects caribou. They're in these environments that are more subject to wildfires, which we see increasing in the province year after year,
Yeah.
because, climate change is just rapid and hard to control. So yeah, I mean that's another impact that affects caribou, not only
Everyone.
caribou, but all the other species that are existing in those destroyed habitats.
Yeah, this is totally off script, but that's interesting. So what insulates sort of old growth forest from the impacts of forest fire?
Yeah, they old growth forests have denser canopies, higher concentrations of moisture. They don't allow for that quick widespread that allows those forest fires to get really out of control and to a point where it is impacting whole habitats and spreading to towns. We lost I believe it was Lytton a few years ago. The town went up. So I mean, having those old growth forests not only protects the wildlife, but the people in those surrounding communities.
Yeah, I mean and then this has been a topic that Steve and I have really been getting on lately is just about a lot of the habitat, and you were talking about the biodiversity and the way that we as humans are managing the landscape, and are we managing correctly, and how is it really impacting everything around that? So this all stems then to the Caribou Recovery Program, and this is the basis for why the government, at least from this side, from from the American side, we're looking at it over here, is that predators obviously feeding too much on caribou, and so we need to call the predators. But has any of this other discussion about maybe taking logging, a little bit of logging away, maybe saving or enacting environmental protections for some of these old growth forests, does any of that come into conversation with anything that you guys are into?
I mean, we definitely advocate for the protection of old growth and habitats and keeping those things intact. And, we've seen a lot of frameworks come out in the last few years from the provincial government, where, some of the key points in those agreements are, protecting and conserving habitats, restoring and enhancing ecosystems, helping species at risk recover, and then using nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to the efforts of climate change while also supporting biodiversity. But then you have the economic side of things that, doesn't really allow those things to move forward. They're nice words, but it would be great to see those initiatives actually implemented. Even more recently, the speech from the throne just happened in the BC legislature, and there was such a large focus within that speech on advancing the economy and creating new jobs. And throughout that same speech, it was mentioned that BC has abundant natural resources, which was pretty shocking to hear, because any resource used in excess is eventually going to disappear. I mean, we're seeing, old growth disappear, maybe not at a rapid pace, but at a pace fast enough that we're seeing it affect other species. We're seeing it impact climate change. We're seeing it, you know, increase the frequency in wildfires as well as the severity of wildfires. Um, and things like within those framework, protecting biodiversity is one thing that the government kind of mentions quite often, and culling wolves goes directly against that. Wolves support biodiversity and ecosystems that they inhabit. There's lots of studies that have shown this. We aren't seeing protection of habitat. We're seeing continued extraction that disturbs habitat and ultimately affects wildlife and humans.
I'm curious about how moose, elk, and deer play into this whole story with the dynamic of these different ungulate species in the same space in conjunction with the decline of habitat.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of wolves being killed with moose and deer and elk, we're seeing an increase in chronic wasting disease in the province, and wolves have been shown to decrease the spread of disease, right? And I'm sure that those populations are impacted as well, but obviously not to the severity that caribou have been. And if there was a real concern that these animals were at risk, it's quite confusing that we're allowing these animals to be hunted in such abundance throughout the province.
So when you went into this, because you had when we were gonna have you on, I think a few weeks ago, that you had gone to, there was a Caribou Recovery Program Q&A or a town hall that was held. What were some of the things that you learned while you were there or took note of that were discussed? Was any of the stuff that we're talking about early on here about habitat loss, about, climate, invasive ungulates in terms of the way herds are shifting? Did any of that come up, or what were the things that you took away from that town hall?
Yeah, so the Caribou Recovery Program holds a stakeholder meeting. They used to do it quarterly. Now it is biannually, following the release of an e-newsletter that they send out. Unfortunately, the meeting was quite disappointing. A lot of questions are usually asked, and they're often met with very evasive answers. We try to ask questions about habitat, and a lot of the responses that we get are a bit pointed, but they are, oh well, we're working on it kind of deal. And so, for example, in the e-newsletter, they mentioned that the Southern Mountain Caribou Habitat Initiative is ongoing in 3 herds, which is the Groundhog Herd, Columbia North, and Central Selkirks. And in the newsletter, they said, we're excited to start the formal planning process this winter for the following additional herds. And that's, kind of a disappointing thing to read when this call has been ongoing for 10 years. Like, why haven't these, habitat initiatives been implemented before we've started killing all of these wolves? Like, if the government has acknowledged so many times that the main cause of caribou decline is habitat loss, and if that was a serious concern, you would think that those initiatives would be implemented in a more timely fashion. Other things that were mentioned throughout that meeting and within the newsletter, one of the most disappointing things is updated information on wolf populations and distribution is required to better inform our understanding of the current condition of caribou herds and inform caribou recovery planning. When you hear that, it's kind of like, does the province understand how many wolves there are, where they reside, how they roam, how we might be impacting them by just wiping out, 80% of populations in certain herd ranges? Um, Again, going back to areas where we've seen wolves need to be reintroduced, that's really concerning that we don't necessarily have an idea of how many there are.
I mean, what's the selection or what's the process? Because you talk about certain populations or sections maybe of the province and where are they directing to cull in certain areas with certain packs? Is it looking at the three caribou herds that you mentioned and seeing how those are functioning, and then they decide, okay, we're going to go in and cull wolves from this area? What is their rationale or their sort of instruction base to these folks that they hire and use money from their taxpayers to do these sorts of calls?
Yeah, so management happens within certain herd ranges. So herds that are showing rapid decline is where they're culling wolves. I believe it's 15 herds at the moment that are subject to predator reduction. So within those areas, some of the targets are eliminating 80% of the wolves within that landscape. And, we've seen potentially more than that. I mean, just in the last year, between January and March, 34 complete packs of wolves were completely eliminated from the landscape, which is quite devastating. Those are family units. These are highly intelligent social land mammals, and to be losing their entire families is really, really disappointing to see. Um, in terms of where they choose to reduce, I'm just pulling up an example here. All of these. So one of the areas that they've been focused on for quite a few years is the Tweedsmuir caribou herd. Their population is about 160 caribou, and their long-term trend has been shown to be decreasing. And so I guess they're looking at that and deciding, well, they're obviously being predated on it at an unsustainable rate from their perspective. And so that's when they jump in and decide that they're going to kill wolves within that herd range.
I mean, what are the methods used to cull packs? They're trapped or aerial gunning, or what do they use? Both.
Aerial gunning is the main one, but in conjunction with aerial gunning, what they do is they collar one individual wolf from a pack. It's called a Judas wolf, and that wolf wears a radio collar, and so the helicopter will fly over and beep that radio collar to see if that wolf is with other animals, within its pack, and then they just kill all of them.
And there's no discrepancy within. Okay, so when they call all these wolves, is there any? I don't know if there's any livestock up there in the province, or there's any sort of production in that way. Is there any thought to the way this would impact anybody who's ranching or farming in that area? I don't know if that's a thing up in the province, so correct me if I'm wrong. But if you're eliminating multiple packs and family structures, you're going to leave a lot of discombobulation within the population to not only predate on caribou, but also predate on unsuspecting livestock that may not be, privy to that, or the farmers or livestock folks being prepared.
Yeah, I mean, as an organization, we've filed many, many freedom of information requests, and within most of those requests, we see a lot of um, cooperation between livestock and ranch owners, even communicating with the aerial gunners that they've seen wolves. We've read records of dead piles, which essentially just a pile of dead animals. Of course, that's going to attract predators. Wolves are scavengers, right? They have a great sense of smell that clearly would draw them in. And so we've seen record of them reporting back to these contractors that they've had wolves on their property, and that kind of gives those contractors an idea of where to go the following day. We know, and a lot of the scientific community knows, that when you are killing wolves at that rapid of a pace, you're supporting higher reproduction rates. We're having less experienced younger animals, teaching a new generation. And so if they aren't that experienced, they are more than likely to go after those, livestock, easy prey, like available sheep. And, if there's not proper animal husbandry in place to keep predators out, there's going to be, of course, an influx in that. As far as records, I haven't necessarily looked into that myself in the areas where they are, doing these operations. But from what we can see from Freedom of Information requests, a lot of livestock owners are cooperating, with this program and essentially supporting the eradication of these wolves.
Is there any part of the province in terms of this of these habitat saving measures or these caribou measures? Are there any non-lethal methods being promoted within the province to give livestock? It doesn't seem like, I don't know the numbers of what the livestock take would be for predators, and not just wolves. There's cougars and everything else up there. But what are there any of those implemented in there, or is it they're just at the behest of the government to see that they're going to cull as many wolves as possible, so it'll basically keep the ranches safe from all the stuff that's happening?
From what I understand, and I may not be completely correct, but many farmers are part of an association that they are reimbursed for livestock losses from depredation. I think there's a process of investigating the kill to ensure that a predator within the landscape has taken it, but I believe that program exists. Yeah, that's I'm
Yeah,
unsure what the reimbursement rate would be, but I'm confident that program exists within the province.
sure.
I'm curious. So when they say that the rate at which caribou are being hunted by predators is unsustainable, I think was the word that you said they used. I mean, is some part of that true, in that the habitat reduction is making them very vulnerable and therefore predation is disproportionately successful? Or could they sustain the level of predation they're experiencing even in the absence of an abundance of habitat? I mean, or what's your feeling about that word unsustainable?
I mean, historically, we have called as a province, wolves have been called in the past. But again, like, was that an impact of habitat? I mean, we've been
Exactly.
logging for
Yeah.
a very long time. Um, I do believe that caribou are more susceptible to predation with the destruction of this habitat. However, uh, I also believe that wolves don't overeat. They don't overpopulate.
Right.
They don't overconsume. They take what they need.
Yep.
And I think a big part of this program is proactionary thing, like, oh, wolves could predate on these caribou because of the habitat loss. But again, going back to Freedom of Information requests, I mean, a lot of times contractor notes do state, oh, seen wolves on this kill. And more often than not, it's deer or moose.
Hmm.
Even within the last year of the 3 months that they, were out calling these animals, and within their observations, I believe there was only 3 incidents within that Freedom of Information request where they were feeding on a caribou carcass. The other incidents that they observed were moose or deer.
Yeah, this is just like it's like the double-edged sword, where if we keep degrading the habitat, then predation could, in theory, have more of an effect, whereas maybe it would not if the habitat was pristine. And then we always turn to predators as the core issue.
Yeah, and I mean, if we keep killing predators,
Yeah,
more than likely prey numbers will increase. But without habitat,
it doesn't matter.
That prey, yeah,
Yeah.
they have no chance.
And they'll be more susceptible to bad winters and all sorts of things. And I assume that the success of calves will continue to have issues if they don't have that kind of protective habitat. Even smaller predator species are going to be able to take advantage of calves. I mean, it's a lose-lose to not have that habitat.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, from your perspective, like when you look at this, because you love predators, so it's like, what are there issues, or the government seems very focused on the wolf issue or the wolf population problem. They're not concerned with bears or lions up there, or whatever could feasibly impact caribou herds, because it can't just be one predator species.
Yeah.
So why the focus on wolves and not, overall? I'm not, again, this is not me promoting overall culling of predators. That's not my point. But it's just like, why the focus on the wolf and not the general, like people usually just general paintbrush? Why is that?
Well, there is focus on mountain lions as well. Cougars
Okay.
are a part of this program. They are being eradicated in certain herd areas. And so what happens is, apart from aerial gunning, they contract houndsmen to come out and chase the cougars with dogs, and then they shoot them typically once they're in a tree. So it's not necessarily a blanket paintbrush. I mean, they are concerned about other predators as well, but wolves definitely have a target on their back when it comes to this.
Yeah.
And perhaps because they do, I mean, from the data that's published, seem to have a larger population than cougars. And I do really love cougars as well, and cougars have a harder time existing in colder climates, and so that could influence why they're predating on caribou in lower parts of the province, because that's where that predator reduction effort with cougars comes in. We haven't seen that yet, and hopefully not in more northern parts of the province, but that could also be cougars aren't as abundant up there.
What's kind of the delay?
In my opinion, is economic. I mean, they don't want to impact the forestry industry, and I do understand that everybody in the province needs to make a living 100%. We don't want to take anyone's livelihood away from them. However, there could be other ways to make changes and create more sustainable logging practices. There's always another way. And culling wolves is a quick, cheap fix for the government. It's like quick and dirty, like putting lipstick on a pig. Unfortunately, it's just it helps them look like something's being done while kind of distracting from these larger industries. I mean, our province helps the forest industry. We subsidize the forest industry. I think it's like $365 million a year, or a day, sorry, which is crazy. And that's just,
that is wild.
yeah, it's sorry,
Wow.
It's 3.65 billion in subsidies spent on the logging industry in the last 10 years.
Yeah, that makes more sense. That's a huge difference.
Yeah. It, and compared to killing wolves, I mean, it's over 11 million taxpayer dollars that have been spent to kill wolves. So it's largely in my opinion, a game of distraction.
Everything that you're describing, we seem to be going down this track a lot more of habitat being the focus of the macro issue are these habitat losses, these larger winters, these snowpacks, these climate-inducing incidents that really change the landscape and change the populations of all the wildlife that are inside landscapes. And we're not tackling the larger problem. We're really just narrowly micro-focusing on the thing that doesn't necessarily, it will have an impact. No one, I think, on this podcast is saying that wolves won't have an impact or predators won't have an impact, but not to the extent that larger instances through nature do. Bigger issues. So sorry, go ahead, Mollie, if you...
Oh, it's all good. The key metals being mined in BC are copper, gold, silver, and zinc.
So they're still mining up there. So yeah, so it's a matter of, taking, like you said, taking jobs, economic prosperity to a degree away from not only the province itself, but also the people that are doing these jobs and figuring that out. I just wonder what the other ways would be to, extract those things and have a better relationship within, the province in that way. I mean, because I went through the campaign that you guys have, which is the Care About Wolves, which it gets Caribou and Bout. So it's anyway, it's a nice play on words. And like you said just before, 10 million plus in taxpayer money being used for these culls per year. You're looking at the rate, and I think you mentioned I think it's roughly around 250 wolves per year being culled at that kind of a rate. So obviously reproduction rates are going up. Where does the public sit on these issues in that? Are you seeing folks knowing, like, is it out there that people are aware, hey, your money's being used towards X, Y, and Z program to be able to keep caribou alive? I mean, is that, where does that sort of sit in the public trust, understanding where their money's going and what's actually being affected?
Yeah, that's a great question. This program was not voted by the public. It had a very soft and kind of secret launch about it. It's causing a lot of public outcry, and there's many concerned British Columbians that have expressed that they do not consent for their tax dollars to fund this kind of initiative in a democracy that should matter to government. We delivered a petition with 500,000 signatures to the legislature in opposed to the wolf call, and yet here we are, and it's entering its 10th year.
There's always two that we've been noticing, this real disconnect between what the populace of any state or town or city or province, it's not that it's always the opposite, but boy, it really seems like the majority of folks are sort of in contrast with what governmental agencies or people at the top are really promoting downstream. So in that way, what are you doing? Because you have something too in this section where it's the Species at Risk Act, or SARA, which you guys have there. What does this act do, I guess, overall, and how is it helping, harming caribou wolves in this situation? So what does SARA mean for those who are not in the province? And then, what's the fallout from this, and how does it help this situation or harm it?
Yeah, the purpose of the SARA, the Species at Risk Act, is to prevent wildlife species in Canada from disappearing. And although this legislation obviously seems well-intentioned, it's disappointing to consistently see reactive measures being implemented to protect wildlife as opposed to proactive measures like protecting these old-growth forests. If we protected habitat and didn't prioritize industrialization, we wouldn't need to have these reactionary and often lethal responses when it comes to wildlife management. Kind of everything, again, links back to habitat. And with species at risk, it is federal legislation, and I think a big part of why British Columbia is doing this is kind of to avoid the federal government needing to step in and take over, and this is kind of their way of being like, oh no, we're taking care of it. But protecting species at wildlife, protecting wildlife species in Canada from disappearing, how is that necessarily justified? Killing one species to save another, that's just extermination. That's not, that's not well intentioned. It's it kind of goes against the fundamental purpose of having that legislation. I mean, we kill one, and then how much killing needs to be done before that species is now a species at risk.
Yeah. I mean, this is where getting into it is that you're talking about two different population sets. People are focused on caribou, but then when you start calling a predator population, as you say, you want to avoid getting into that reintroduction or repopulation stage, which, as many people know, but coyotes, I think especially, which it was the same like with the American West, right? They tried to eradicate coyotes and they just exploded. They could never put it under control. Wolves are the same way. I don't think reproduce as quickly or as often. I could be wrong on that. Steven, you might know more than me on coyote reproduction, but it just seems to be something that, it's like you're, doing one thing and it doesn't help in the other. Positive steps in this direction, though, because we always want to bring in the Indigenous voice, and this is something that Steve and I are really trying to hammer home. There's First Nations management protection of caribou and wolves, so they understand the correlation, it seems, between both of these. There's tripartite. Am I saying that correctly, Mollie?
I believe so.
Okay, tripartite framework agreement on nature conservation. What are these steps going forward that are why are they positive in these sorts of, are they looking at habitat? Is it strictly about caribou and wolf relationship? What are these things? What do these things mean? And how are they positive moving forward for both of these critters?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do think it's important to remember that First Nations throughout British Columbia are very diverse when it comes to their relationships with wildlife and wildlife management strategies. It's a strong autonomy and unfair to assume that every nation has similar priorities when it comes to wildlife management. And, we respect Indigenous sovereignty and when it comes to wildlife management within their territories. But are strongly opposed to the BC government's involvement in this call, as well as the use of tax dollars to fund it. As far as that tripartite framework agreement on nature conservation, the key points within that are protecting and conserving habitats, restoring and enhancing ecosystems and habitats, helping species at risk recover, and using nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change while also supporting biodiversity. Again, these are great initiatives and we most certainly welcome them, but seeing the rollout of a lot of frameworks over time, it's hard to not just assume that they are simply pretty words. We've seen the pattern over time, again, of these frameworks coming out, but no real meaningful action being implemented to follow through on them. Um, you know, Again, I do understand, the people need jobs, people have to work. Um, One of the biggest parts of our economy though is tourism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It funds our economy greatly. And again, so many people from all over the world come to British Columbia to see the wildlife and to see the landscape. And, I applaud framework like that for being introduced, but it would be very nice to see um, it being implemented in a meaningful way. And again, calling wolves goes directly against these points. Wolves are a nature-based solution to a lot
Yep.
of the problems that we see. An example of this biodiversity, wolves increase biodiversity again in the ecosystems and habitats that they inhabit. We need to see protection of a habitat, and we continue to see extraction and activity that disturbs habitat and further disturbs wildlife. And so again, it would be really nice to see frameworks like that, follow through. But unfortunately, the government would have to set aside some of the economic agenda that they are consistently pursuing. And, as British Columbians, I think a lot of us would like to see that. But figuring out how to do it in a sustainable way seems to be a struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and Stephen always brings this point up too, is that, wolves are a very good driver of keeping the herds healthy. And so as much as many people think that, there may be less ungulates on the, you're going to have a healthier herd with a pack animal like that, moving them around and making sure that they're not overgrazing and doing the things that they do. So Mollie, for this, like, what's information, like something about the wolves up there that maybe we didn't hit that people should know about, or how would they get involved in some of these issues outside of like people who are inside the province who are listening to this, and then for people who are outside of it, because I think that's a very key thing, is to have voices from all over if they're targeted in a way that's going to make a sound difference.
Yeah, I mean, supporting Pacific Wild for sure is one of the best ways. I mean, we work really hard to try and end this and advocate for wolves in the province. Outside of the call, I mean, wolves are being hunted at a rapid pace in the province, and outside of Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland, you don't even have to report that you've killed a wolf. So a lot of wolves are being killed. And the data of how many are being killed is largely unknown. Hunter sample surveys are sent to about 20% of hunters in the province. So that obviously indicates a huge gap in data, and it just supports further eradication of this species within British Columbia. So, I
Yeah.
mean, in terms of, protecting wolves and trying to keep them safe, and promoting healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, supporting Pacific Wilds is definitely one way that you can help with that. Another way, write a letter to our tourism minister. And if you're from somewhere else, say I'm, not to put words in anybody's mouth, but who wants to visit a province where this is happening and is largely unknown? There are so many British Columbians even that don't even know that this program exists. And it's when they find out about it, they're horrified. And especially to find out that their tax dollars are being used. Yeah, I mean, we created a poster at Pacific Wild last year, a tourism poster. We encourage people in the public, if they're interested in and moved by this, we can provide you with a copy of that poster to put or share on your social media. Drawing awareness is one of the biggest ways that we can inflict change and hopefully try and end this program, and advocate for more sustainable and non-lethal solutions, to protect both wolves and caribou.
Yeah, we totally agree. I mean, we're going to have obviously your website and all these initiatives that are in the description of the podcast when people are listening. So please go to the description so you guys can see that, support them. Their website's great. They have a ton of information, an absolute ton. Like we touched on some good stuff here. And so go and read about that. Last question for you, Mollie, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
You know what? I had a very beautiful experience with a wolf last year. I think they're incredible animals. But we as a team, we were out doing some field work, and we were in a little boat, and this wolf was just walking along the shoreline, minding its own business, and it was just really beautiful to see this natural wild creature, existing in its habitat and like completely uninterested in people and just wanting to do its own thing. And it was this beautiful West Coast rugged scene with this wolf running along the beach, and it's one of those moments that kind of touches your heart, and you're like, these animals deserve to be on this landscape, and they deserve to be free, and they deserve to exist without the fear of a helicopter flying over them and killing them and their whole family.
Yeah. Can't agree more on that one. Mollie Cameron, you're doing outstanding work, and thank you for going through all the details and the policy and stuff with us. We really appreciate it for everybody who's listening out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hang tight while we sign off. House Deal out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.